Friends, very good to see you. Thank you for joining us. James, nice to see you too.
Nice to see you too, Ian. Yeah, very good.
And we'd like to welcome both new viewers, if you're new to the videos and the channel, very warm welcome, but also a big welcome to our regular viewers. I want to give a shout out to one of our loyal viewers.
Yes.
And that is my mother-in-law, Pam.
Yeah.
So it's quite funny. Sometimes when we're recording one, I can actually hear her in the other room across listening to last week's.
Pam, it's really great to have you as one of our loyal viewers. Yeah.
Absolutely. Just for those who don't know, Pam, my mother-in-law, lives with us, and she's coming up 92, and she's still devoted to the scriptures. So a good model for all of us.
One of our top fans.
Absolutely. Now, James, we're episode 120, and I mathematically think that 120 is less interesting than 119 because 120 is obviously 12 times 10, and those are very important numbers. It's interesting, isn't it, that people are more fascinated by numbers that are a bit obscure and hidden, like the fact that 119, I said last week, is 7 times 17. So, but you're a great fan of 120.
Well, 120 looks like a boring number until you realise it's biblical, of course, and it's interesting because it's kind of tops and tails scriptures a little bit, in the sense that in Genesis 6, the Lord declares that the span of life of a mortal shall be 120 years. So that's interesting. But then again, on the day of Pentecost, Luke records 120 people gathered. So that's interesting, isn't it? So
it is. I don't know if anybody makes a connection there. I'm not sure Luke is particularly noting that, but
I don't think so. No, and it's quite a common. It's actually quite a common number in the Bible elsewhere. Yeah. So it's worth having a little look if you're interested in numbers.
Yes, it is indeed. Yeah. And of course, it means that Pam's going to be watching us for another 28 years. So we better keep going.
Exactly. So we better get to it, really.
Good. Now, actually, I'm actually really excited about our passage this week because it's quite short, but there's loads in it, and there's loads of distinctively marked and stuff. But also, back again, we're in a week where the lectionary does the right thing with the text.
Yes, it does. We're on Mark chapter 10, verses 46 to 52. It's the last Sunday after Trinity. Those of you who will breathe a sigh of relief if you need to. We're nearly at that pivotal moment of All Saints. It's the story of Bartimaeus. So, and of course, we've been delving quite consistently into Mark chapter 9 and chapter 10. So those of you who are regular viewers will feel that this is significantly connected with what has gone before, and we'll no doubt make those connections as we go along.
Yes. And unfortunately, unlike last week, the lectionary doesn't skip out a really important section.
No, it doesn't. It is an absolute continuation from last time, actually. Yeah. And no skips. Yeah.
And what is also interesting is that this is significant. We've talked about this section from chapter 8 through to the end of chapter 10, and it is interesting that it's very significant in its organization. I just want to share something from this is from a book, Reading, Marking, Context, where John Goodrich, who's actually one of the editors of the book, has a discussion of the structure here and the significance of it. So I'm just going to share a little clip from that, which is really helpful graphic, I think. And it's really helped me to make sense of the shape of this text, where it is, and also, as we get through, the ethos of the narrative as we feel it, because there is a sort of change of gear here. And I hadn't noticed this before reading this in John's comment. So we have two healings of a blind person.
Yeah.
And the first one is unique to Mark. So it's the gradual secret healing of the blind man. This is the person who says, when Jesus touched him first, and he says, "What do you see?" And he says, "I see men like trees walking," which I think is a lovely phrase.
Yeah, fantastic.
It is. And of course, it follows the second feeding. So feeding of the 5,000, feeding of the 4,000.
Yeah.
And it sort of illustrates the fact that just as this person needs 2 touches to have their sight restored, so the disciples need more than one, as it were, touch of Jesus in his teaching to actually understand what the heck's going on.
Yeah.
And it's just fascinating that we've noticed this as we've gone through, haven't we? That there's this constant, in these passages, constant tension between Jesus clearly presenting his need for suffering and the disciples clearly failing to understand that.
Yeah.
And last week, we noted, David Garland said that as Jesus approaches Jerusalem, the disciples don't approach any clear understanding. So you've got this constant tension throughout. And then now, when we get to this episode, actually suddenly, for Bartimaeus, everything becomes clear.
Yeah. Yeah. It is extraordinary. And of course, we talk sometimes in Mark, don't we, about the messianic secret, about the fact that, the nature of Jesus is hidden, even though actually, there are clues there.
Plain, yeah.
And so this feels like just before, I mean, this passage comes just before the beginning of the Passion narrative in Mark. So what you've got here is kind of what I think is something of perhaps a pivotal moment where the scales have fallen from the eyes, and everything is clear on public display. Jesus affirmed. I mean, he was, of course, affirmed by Peter in sort of privately to the disciples, but here this is a large crowd, a great crowd. Yes. I think it is that Mark records in this story. So it feels like a really important, pivotal moment.
It is. And it is distinctive here of Mark's organisation of material as well. I mean, it is an interesting episode as well to reach for your Throckmorton.
Yes.
Just stop there. You have yours to hand, I think.
I do.
Right hand.
If anybody wants to have a quick, which way are we going here? This way.
That way around. Yeah, Gospel Parallels.
It's Throckmorton's Parallels.
Anyway.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Just because this is, again, one of these episodes in Mark where it's in all three synoptics. And actually, Matthew and Luke do have their own interesting kind of twist on it.
Yeah, they do. Yeah.
But it also means that, like last week's episode, we can notice some really distinctive Markan language here, which is significant for the way he tells the story.
Yeah.
So should we get to the text then?
Yeah.
And they came to Jericho. So again, we've got this traveling motif we've seen in the last two sections. As he was leaving Jericho with his disciples and a great crowd. You mentioned the significance of the great crowd there already. And the other two accounts, Matthew and Luke, actually slightly disagree about position. I think Luke positions this at the entrance because, of course, as Jesus leaves Jericho.
Yeah, as he approached Jericho and Luke, yeah.
Should we be worried about those minor differences?
Well, it seems that the obvious point is Jericho, and Jericho either entrance. It's indicative, isn't it, of the journey of Jesus to Jerusalem to suffer and to die. So, and in a sense, it's the last stopping point, really, because once you hit Jericho, you're then walking up. You're ascending from that very low point on the earth up to Jerusalem. It's the classic road. So I think that feels more important to me than whether it's approaching or leaving.
I think Jericho is both the lowest inhabited city on earth and also the oldest city, the known city, I think.
There's something, there is evidence of 8,000 BC, I think. Don't know whether that's really old or not very good on archaeology, but certainly it's very, very low because it's right by the Dead Sea.
Yeah. Although, interestingly, you could say that's symbolic, and from there Jesus climbs up. Actually, Mark doesn't make anything of that.
He doesn't, no, he doesn't. And I don't think he uses the word up after that, does he? So,
even though we've noticed it before. So,
yeah.
Now, here's an interesting thing about the name. Well, there's lots of interesting things about the name Bartimaeus. One is that this is the only time where someone's healed in Mark where they're named.
Yes.
And neither Matthew nor Luke include the name. So it's obviously this name was obviously significant for Mark, and he obviously thinks for his readers.
Yes, and I think he's the only named person who's healed in all of the synoptics, actually, in three synoptics. So which is interesting. I mean, I think we ought to reference Richard Borkham here in this because his work on
hello Richard, if you're watching, by the way.
It was so helpful in the reasons and why names appear in the New Testament. And of course his main point over Bartimaeus would be that this is somebody who was known in the early church and almost certainly the person who told the story and therefore was the guardian of the story, and therefore this sense that we have in Mark of these, as I'm sure we'll look at, these eyewitness details is coming from the very mouth of the person who was the main character alongside who was healed. So and that makes perfect sense, doesn't it? At the rational level, I think the argument is basically unassailable, really. But
it is. The reason why it's that significant is that partly it ties in with obviously Richard's work on eyewitnesses, but I've been taught, and probably have said, it's said quite commonly, that the difference between the named and the unnamed is the importance of the person. So the classic example is John 3 and John 4, where people say, oh, look, a named important man and an unnamed unimportant woman in the two chapters. But in fact, that's not the narrative reason for the naming or the not naming.
No.
So that's what's bearing in mind. Now, it is curious that Mark says Bartimaeus, the son of Timaeus, because the word bar in Aramaic means son of. So what he's saying is the son of Timaeus, who's the son of Timaeus, which isn't much help, really. It's a bit like Thomas, the twin Didymus. Well, Thomas means twin and Didymus means twin. So not much is being added here. But maybe there's another significance to that.
Well, it's interesting. James Edwards, in his commentary, has a footnote which alludes to a paper by a couple of folks who argue that Timaeus was the best known dialogue of Plato at the time. And so calling out son of Timaeus is a way of connecting with Greco-Roman culture and perhaps speaking into it with an old, a sort of another person in the dialogue. So that's interesting. I mean, it's speculative, but maybe there's something in that. Or maybe it's simply for people who don't understand Aramaic.
Well, and that is, again, a reminder. We have these one or two moments in the Gospels where we're just reminded that the move from a context which is Hebrew and Aramaic speaking to a context which is Greek speaking is part of the missional dynamic of bearing testimony in the wider world. So the Gospel has been taken from this particular small place and it's being broadcast out into the wider world. My favorite example of that is in John 1:38, where there's two disciples of John who approach Jesus, say, Rabbi, and then the writer of the Gospel says, which being translated means teacher. Well, it doesn't actually mean teacher, it means my great one, but the cultural significances of teaching. And again, it's a very explicit reminder that this kind of translation happens, which is why translation, education, writing and stuff has always gone hand in hand with Christian mission.
Absolutely. Yeah. We always need help.
Yeah. So he's sitting by the roadside. Now, this is probably the moment just to note that a major tension between this account in Mark and the account in Matthew is that Matthew has two unnamed beggars, blind beggars, whereas Mark has one named. So this is one of the points. This is one of the very common points where people say, oh, here is an unreconcilable contradiction between Matthew and Mark, because this isn't the only time where Matthew appears to double the number of people.
Yeah, and yet why can't Mark tell the story of only one of them? Maybe only one of them was known in the early church. That would, perfectly reasonable explanation. And also, of course, at the gate of the city or the entrance, or whether it's at the entrance or leaving, the gates of cities were places, as I guess in a sense they are today, where people congregate who are in need.
Tube stations, I find when I go to London.
Tube stations, yes, the gateways to modern cities.
The tube station, there's always somebody.
Because there's lots of people going through there, and their needs can be, people can ask for help with their needs. So there's a kind of logic that, Bartimaeus wouldn't have been the only blind beggar in Jericho, and then people with other challenges. So I don't think it's a problem.
No. And the other really interesting thing is that I just did, and folks, you can see that I'm not going to share it now, but you can see the text on the accompanying commentary, which will be in the next, following on the next blog post. It is really interesting that Matthew is interested in cardinal numbers.
He is.
So just all over. So where Mark says that Jesus saw Simon and Andrew by the sea in Mark 1, Matthew says Jesus saw two brothers.
Yeah.
And he does that several times. And then in comparison with Luke, where in Luke 22, Jesus says, you'll sit on thrones. Matthew says, you'll sit on 12 thrones.
Yes.
It's really noticeable that Matthew is always adding in the numbers.
Yeah.
So it seems to me he's not doubling the number. He's just simply wanting always to have, to highlight the numbers and also to include as many as he can.
Yeah.
And of course, there's the whole thing in the background, which will be important to Matthew, of the Old Testament rules about eyewitness testimony. Because in Deuteronomy, I think it's Deuteronomy 7 and Deuteronomy 17, it says, don't believe the testimony of one person, but only believe if two people agree.
Yes.
Again, we can see little lines of that. And it seems to me that's part of what Matthew's wanting to communicate, that this is a reliable witness. So
yeah, absolutely.
But that table of examples is very interesting, isn't it? So
it is. And the other thing that's interesting here is the location, isn't it, of Bartimaeus? sitting by the roadside. That's
Yes.
so fascinating, isn't it? I mean, not least because by the end of the story, he's on the road. So he starts off beside the road, and then he's on the road. He's marginalised and sidelined at the beginning. He's following Jesus by the end.
Now, we did notice last week this language of on the road, on the way. And again, I think the variation in English translations actually slightly obscures this. So I'm just looking at the ESV, and at the beginning, this phrase, by the podos, says by the roadside. At the end, it says on the way, but it's the same phrase in Greek. I'm just looking at the NIV, whether it does the same thing. Yeah, again, it says by the roadside at first, and at the end it said, now the NIV makes a bit more of a collection. It says that he follows him along the road. But what we won't get from that from English translations is this phrase, on the way. This is what Mark's been using to describe Jesus' journey on the way to Jerusalem, which is the path of discipleship, as Jesus has been trying to explain. In Luke's gospel, 5 times, the Christians are described as, the followers of Jesus are described as those who follow the way, followers of the way. It's followers of the way that Paul persecutes. Then when he's recounting it, he says, I used to persecute followers of the way. And there are several, these 5 moments in Luke's gospel. So this phrase on the way has a kind of technical sense of, he's physically on the roadside, but he's not yet a disciple. And he's physically on the road, and he now is one who is following.
Yes. So even though the word is the same, the translators have interpreted that within the light of that. I mean, which feels entirely reasonable.
But it's always a dynamic in translation, which is that whenever you translate, you have to make a decision. Are you going to follow the word for word correspondence, which is the word of God, or are you going to translate the sense? And in doing so, you do miss out those verbal connections.
Yes, you do. So you do miss it in English. Yeah.
Then many rebuked him, telling him to be silent. Just a couple of things really interesting.
We're just leaping over verse 47 there.
Sorry, I'm jumping ahead too far. Yeah.
We have Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me. And Jesus of Nazareth, here's Jesus of Nazareth. And which itself is interesting, isn't it? We should just comment on that. I mean, it doesn't actually say Nazareth in the Greek. It says Nazarene.
It does. And, Jesus of Nazarene.
Yeah, which is also the language which Mark uses in chapter 1.
Yes.
Which I think is really more than just about the place. It's about God's anointed one. It's Samson is similarly described in
Nazarite.
In Nazarite in the Old Testament. So there's a little bit more to it than just where Jesus came from. It seems to me, which is obscured a bit by that translation.
I read somewhere, and I need to dig it out, a theory that, Nazareth was a completely insignificant village at the time.
Yeah.
So the question is, where does the name come from? And I've read a paper which argues that the reason why Nazareth was called Nazareth was because it's related to Netzer, which in Isaiah 11 is the branch of David will be restored. And this was a particular center of devotion and expectation of the Messiah.
That's really interesting, isn't it?
So that's what its significance is. And this is why you see people say when they read the Magnificat, and they go, hang on, how can this 14-year-old uneducated girl have this sort of biblically literate song, which is based on the prayer of Hannah in 1 Samuel? Well, the answer is if she's raised in this community, she'll be saturated in this. Somebody was telling me a story the other day about this is interesting. Yes, so talking to a Muslim woman who was telling her how proud she was of her daughter, aged 8, and how many chapters of the Quran she'd memorized by heart.
Yeah.
Which is just a little pointer that you can find focuses of religious devotion where there, even if there isn't a broad literacy in other terms, there's an intensely deep literacy in the religious text of that community.
Yes.
And that's an example of it.
Yes.
So, if Nazareth is this center of expectation, then it's not surprising. And therefore, it's really significant here, isn't it, that Jesus is described. Normally, a person would be described patronymically, that is, Jesus, the son of Joseph. But here, he's Jesus the Nazarene.
Yes.
And of course, then he says Jesus, son of David, which is again part of that expectation of divinity.
It's another way of saying the same thing. This is because the Messiah is coming from the Davidic line, etc., etc. Yeah. And it's interesting. Bartimaeus is the only person, I think, in Mark. Well, he is the only person in Mark to call Jesus son of David. Jesus uses it later of himself, but that's really interesting, isn't it? And this is, once again, this is one of these, if this is a pivotal moment, it's a moment of revelation, of understanding that Jesus is the Messiah, the promised Messiah in the line of David. Going back to 2 Samuel 7, the promise there.
And also, as you mentioned, it's preparation for the entry into Jerusalem. Because here he is, we're being welcomed as the Son of David.
Hosanna to the Son of David.
And also, there's a little hint there as well that he goes to Jerusalem to be enthroned, and of course, his throne
turns out
the
to be a cross. Yeah.
And we mentioned last week that James and John wants to sit on his left and his right on his throne. And of course, actually, it's the two thieves who are on his left and his right as he's enthroned on the cross. Okay, now we're getting on to the rebuke.
Yes, right. Now we can start rebuking.
I like. There's a little pun here, I think, which is that the verb for rebuke is epitimao. So
Okay. Clever.
He's saying, don't dishonor your family name.
Yeah.
So, and they ask him to be silent. As a tiny little, just note here, in 1 Timothy 2, where Paul says women should learn in silence, this is a different word. So in 1 Timothy 2, Paul uses the word hesukia, which doesn't mean silence, it means in quiet receptiveness. Whereas here, they are telling him to shut up.
Yeah, and in Mark up to this point, I mean, only Jesus has told people to be silent. He's one of them tells demons to be silent.
Yes, of course.
But this is the first time the crowd has tried to silence somebody for exactly the wrong reason, whereas Jesus was silencing demons for, of course, the right reason. So that's interesting, isn't it?
There's a little parallel as well, isn't there, with the disciples rebuking the people who brought children to Jesus for blessing as well. So.
Yeah, so they don't silence them, but they do rebuke. Yeah, exactly.
They do rebuke them.
Yeah.
But I like the enthusiasm here is great, isn't it? It's unfettered. He cried out, all the more, Son of David. And then Jesus stops. That's a nice little detail there.
Well, he stands, doesn't he? He stands still, which is it's not an accurate translation in NIV and ESV. So that's interesting because Jesus is standing for Bartimaeus, and I mean the other place he stands in the New Testament, particularly, is for Stephen, the first martyr. I saw that Son of Man standing at the right hand of, which is always I always think is really significant.
Oh, yeah, okay.
That he stands. I think it's Tom Smell used to make this point that Jesus stands to welcome the first martyr. So he stands here to welcome this faithful blind.
Oh, right, okay.
Thing. I like that idea, but I mean it's an interesting. It does actually say stood.
Yeah, he stood. And really interesting that this emphasis on call. So Jesus says to the crowd, call him. Then the crowd say, take heart, he's calling you.
Yes.
And then they call the blind man and said, he's calling you. So Jesus calls him, the crowd calls him, the crowd calls him and tells him that Jesus is calling him. So it's kind of just... You might just get an idea here. This is important. And of course, but this is an interesting connection back to the early chapters, isn't it? When Jesus calls people to follow him. But also, the other thing that's fascinating is that Mark goes back to his relentless parataxis. So parataxis is where he says, and he did this, and he did this, and he did this, and he did this. Whereas Luke is much more refined. And Luke says, having done this, he then did this, and then he goes on to do the other kind of thing. So you get this sort of breathless energy, and it really does take us back to those early chapters. So the excitement and the clarity of who Jesus is.
Yes. Yeah.
And then in verse 50, we then get some lovely little Mark.
This is the beautiful eyewitness detail.
We don't get any others.
Yeah. And you can imagine Bartimaeus telling Mark, well, this is what I did. I threw my cloak off. I sprang to my feet, and and that's such a wonderful thing. Yeah. But it's also indicative of Bartimaeus's absolute readiness to hear the call of Jesus, isn't it? So all through this, we get this, I sense that Bartimaeus is becoming a model of discipleship, a model of someone responding to the call of Jesus. And so it's a powerful, it comes across very powerfully in Mark. I love the way he tells his stories.
There's another curious connection with Luke in Acts, where isn't it the man who's healed at the gate beautiful? Doesn't he also throw off his cloak and spring up?
He does throw off his cloak. Yes, he certainly, he does one of those things, I think. I can't remember which one, but the similar action is there
And it does.
Acts,
I
definitely.
mean, we've assumed all along that Luke knows Mark's gospel because he's drawn on it. So, is there a little message there that the ministry of the apostles is very much in continuity with the ministry of Jesus and the same sort of thing? So, yeah. And this is really fascinating, isn't it? A blind man cries out to Jesus, stands before him now. Now Jesus is standing, as you said.
Yeah.
Now the blind man is standing before him. So looking at each other face to face. And Jesus looks at the blind man and says, "What do you want me to do for you?" I mean, that's just so striking, isn't it?
It is so. It is so striking. And I mean, Jesus is not about to do something to somebody. He's wanting to do something with that person, with that cooperation that faith has brought, and that's such a significant thing, isn't it?
It is. Yeah, I know that some critics have sort of said that in the Gospels that the disabled are just simply foils for Jesus demonstrating his power. But actually, they're not. This is a three-dimensional character, and of course, if as we've commented, he was an eyewitness source for Mark is writing, then you can see why he's an active agent and a three-dimensional character in this. So, a rabbi. Oh, again, I'm a bit frustrated again here. So
it's not rabbi, it's Rabboni.
Yeah, it is. And I don't know why English translations don't render it like this, because the only other time this word occurs is in John 20, where Mary recognizes Jesus' voice and she says Rabboni. And I've just checked, and the English translations do actually translate it Rabboni there, but not here. And I don't know why.
No, it's odd. And I think once again, Edwards in his commentary comments that Rabboni is, in Jewish literature of the time, is used only as an address to God in prayer. Fascinating, that, isn't it? So it indicates both Bartimaeus, in a sense, and Mark's estimation of Jesus. So once again, that kind of points to this really pivotal moment of recognition.
Yeah, it is.
But of course, we just think of it as a kind of alternative to rabbi. But if that's, Edwards is a really interesting point. So thank you to.
But there are two things that tie into that as well. In Luke 17, I think it is, Jesus says, "Don't call anyone rabbi, because you only have one teacher, which is God." So, and it also ties back to what we said 2 weeks ago about the, that Jesus' challenge to the rich young ruler when he says, "Good teacher," and Jesus says, "Well, who is God good except for God alone?"
Yeah.
So it's a constant kind of Christological narrative.
Yeah.
And I think the other thing that's absolutely fascinating, and this is typical of Jesus's healings, is that he does not wave his hand over him. There's no gesture. There's no kind of magical. There's no incantation. But here's the thing: there's no prayer either.
No.
So when we pray for someone to be healed, we pray to God because we are not the agent of healing. God is.
Yes.
Jesus simply declares.
Yes.
That he's healed.
Yes.
Which is very startling.
Very startling indeed. Yeah. Yeah.
And it's curious that Jesus does not call him to follow. He simply says, "Go on your way."
Go on your way, yes. Of course, your way now is the way you choose, isn't it? It's the way following me, if that's what you're going to respond. So once again, the emphasis is it's in Bartimaeus' response, isn't it? In terms of becoming a disciple. And what we have then, of course, is this, the favorite word of Mark, euthus, immediately. Suddenly,
course, yes. He reminds us again of the early chapters.
Absolutely. Regains his sight, and as we said earlier, follows him on the way. The classic description of discipleship.
That was now his way, was to follow the way of Jesus.
Yeah.
And also notice that your faith has made you well. I think that's almost exactly word for word what he says to the woman with the issue of blood in chapter 5.
Yes. Yeah.
But notice that this isn't about saying you have something called faith and I'm going to swap that for, it's actually saying the fact that you recognized and trusted me, that has been the source of your healing.
Yes, exactly. It's all about the person's perception of Jesus, isn't it?
Yeah. There's lots there. I don't know if there's anything particular you would note in terms of preaching or teaching on this.
I don't think so. I mean, the story itself is. I mean, I think you've got to emphasise the response of the model disciple in a way.
Yeah.
But the story itself, you could do quite a bit of retelling because it's so vivid. And it's not difficult to bring a story. I mean, the story in a sense lives already.
Yes.
It's worth just dwelling on that in a sermon and enabling people to inhabit it in all the multiple dimensions that it has. And some of those little points, those exegetical points that we've mentioned, will help with that, I think. So, yeah.
No, great, exciting stuff. A lovely Markan story told in a Markan way with all sorts of significance for Mark's gospel.
Yeah.
James, we didn't say at the beginning, there are 4 things we love people to do.
Yes, we'd love you to click like on the videos. That'd be great. Do subscribe to the YouTube channel where we put these videos. Do share on your socials. And
on your socials,
absolutely. On your socials, we're right up there, hit cool and trendy with the language now. And do comment on the wherever you find it. We'd love to engage with those comments.
And we've had some really interesting debates, both on the YouTube channel, but actually on social media as well, on the socials over the last couple of weeks. So really stimulating. And some things that people point out, which I hadn't noticed. Just going back 2 weeks ago, rich young ruler. Jesus is our rich young ruler who became poor for our sakes.
Wow, that's
I haven't looked at that.
No, I've not spotted that at all. Thank you for whoever did that.
Yeah, very good.
Wonderful.
Thank you very much, James. Thank you, folks, for joining us, including Pam, and we look forward to seeing you next time.